He stood at the edge of something no science could explain and no theology could contain. Carl Jung was not merely a thinker at this moment. He was a man dissolving into his own unconscious, recording visions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What he would later call the most important years of his life were not marked by lectures or applause, but by silence, dissent, and trembling encounters with voices that came from within. In 1912, on the brink of his psychic disintegration and departure from Freud, Jung did something quietly revolutionary. He turned not to a psychologist, nor to a mystic, but to an American philosopher, William James. And the book that altered the course of Jung's inner life was Pragmatism. At first glance, Pragmatism seems like an unlikely companion to divine madness. It is not mystical. It does not glorify dreams. It does not promise salvation through symbols or archetypes. But it does offer something else, something that would become absolutely vital to Jung, a method for trusting the truth of experience, regardless of whether it fits the mold of science or rationality. In his lectures at Fordham University that same year, Jung wrote in the foreword that he had taken James's pragmatic rule as his guiding principle. But this was not the kind of academic citation one tosses into a footnote. For Jung, this was a lifeline. Because if William James was right, if truth could be judged by its fruits, not by its logic or conformity, then Jung's descent into madness was not a failure of reason. It was a meaningful experience. William James's philosophy was simple but radical. Pragmatism asked, what difference does it make if something is true? If an idea works in life, if it helps us live better, feel deeper, act more courageously, then that idea, regardless of its metaphysical status, earns the title of truth. James wrote, "The true is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief." In other words, truth is not an absolute, it is a tool. Now imagine Jung in the middle of his psychic storm, waking visions, conversations with archetypes, hallucinations of blood, death, and divinity. Imagine the horror of a brilliant man who knew the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia better than anyone, now watching his own mind unravel. What could possibly justify the decision to keep going, to write it down, to record the voices in crimson ink? William James could, because James had already defended the reality of religious experience. He had argued that mystical states, even if unprovable, had pragmatic consequences. They changed people. They bore fruit. They brought about transformations in character, vision, purpose. And that, said James, was enough. Jung took that to heart, and in his red book, he left behind a record of his surrender and his survival. He wrote, "It is unquestionable. If you enter into the world of the soul, you are like a madman, and a doctor would consider you to be sick. What I say here can be seen as sickness, but no one can see it as sickness more than I do. This is how I overcame madness. If you do not know what divine madness is, suspend judgment and wait for the fruits." That is James's pragmatic rule, not quoted, but lived. Jung is saying, call it madness if you must, call it sickness, but wait, see what it becomes. Look at the result, the fruit, the change. This subtle shift in thinking from, is it objectively real, to, what does it do to me, allowed Jung to continue. He no longer had to justify his inner life in terms of science. He could justify it in terms of effect. James gave Jung a container large enough to hold his visions without collapsing under their weight. And so, paradoxically, the philosopher of utility made it possible for the psychologist of myth to walk into the underworld without being crushed by it. Jung didn't need certainty. He needed a reason to keep going. And James had already said it. If the experience brings meaning, coherence, or transformation, then it is true enough. This principle, that truth is not a matter of metaphysical speculation but of lived consequence, quietly rearranged Jung's internal compass. It gave him a permission that science had not granted, and that Freud, with all his brilliance, had actively denied permission to believe in what worked, even if it could not be proven. This was not a rejection of rationality, but an expansion of what counted as rational. To the world around him, Jung was losing his grip. He had abandoned the psychoanalytic movement he helped build. He spoke of talking to Elijah, of being visited by Salome, of descending into a dark, cavernous underworld where serpents and gods conversed with him. This was not psychology by any academic standard. It was visionary. It was mad. But William James had already warned us. The intellect alone is a poor judge of spiritual transformation. James had spent his career defending the outliers, mystics, seers, religious eccentrics. He believed in the plurality of truths, that reality is not a single, closed system, but a living process, evolving through our experience of it. And perhaps this is what struck Jung most deeply, because what Jung was discovering in the depths of his soul was not a system, not a dogma, but an ongoing process of becoming. There is a line in Pragmatism that might as well have been addressed to Jung directly. James writes, "The trail of the human serpent is thus over everything. There is no pure objectivity, no clean philosophy untouched by desire, history, bias, or instinct. We are always involved. The observer is part of the experiment. The thinker is part of the thought." Jung understood this at a visceral level. When he confronted the archetypes in the Red Book, he was not just describing psychological concepts, he was meeting them. They were real in the way dreams are real. Not because they exist in space, but because they exist in psyche. And the moment you engage with the psyche as real, the rules of the external world begin to blur. But instead of fearing that blur, William James welcomed it. He didn't see it as a threat to truth. He saw it as a richer truth. If religious visions brought strength, courage, meaning, or transformation, then they deserved serious consideration, not dismissal. James was not asking for belief. He was asking for openness, for suspension of judgment, for the courage to wait for the fruits. Jung's Red Book is filled with this kind of suspended judgment. He does not try to convince the reader that Elijah and Salome are historically real, or that Abraxas rules the cosmos. He simply records what happened to him, faithfully, painfully, vividly. And then he reflects on the effects, how these visions changed him, what they taught him, what came next. This is the pragmatic spirit, not to explain away, but to watch what unfolds. James didn't care whether a belief was true in a metaphysical sense. He asked, what is its cash value in experiential terms? In other words, what happens to a person who believes this? Carl Jung was living the answer. He believed the psyche had its own voice. He believed the unconscious was not just a garbage bin of repressed impulses, but a living reality, full of intelligence, terror, and wisdom. And when he took these beliefs seriously, not metaphorically, but literally enough, something began to shift. He began to change. His breakdown became a breakthrough. His madness became a method. His fear became fuel. But none of this would have happened without that crucial pivot. Without the space to say, maybe this is madness, but let's not label it yet. Let's see what it becomes. Let's see where it leads. That is James. That is pragmatism. It is not flashy. It does not claim to offer ultimate truths or final answers. It simply asks us to pay attention to consequences. It gives us a humble, sturdy framework for navigating the unknown, not by erasing mystery, but by embracing it with discernment. And for Jung, that discernment was everything, because he knew he could not measure the visions he was receiving with any existing scientific tool. But with James in hand, he could ask a more vital question. What are these visions doing to me? Are they making me more whole? Are they calling me deeper into myself? Are they awakening something that had long been buried? If the answer was yes, and it was, then that was enough. This shift in Jung's philosophy, from seeking objective certainty to trusting subjective transformation, was not a small intellectual move. It was a radical reorientation of his soul. It meant that the terrifying things he was seeing were not signs of pathology, but possible initiations. It meant that the voices he heard were not to be silenced, but listened to. It meant that his inner life, as chaotic as it appeared, could be meaningful, not in spite of its irrationality, but because of it. James had made the case that truth is always tethered to utility, not in the shallow material sense, but in the deepest existential sense. Does it help you live? Does it help you grow? Does it deepen your capacity for life? Jung embraced this, He stopped asking whether his visions were factually real and started asking whether they were psychically real. And this allowed him to develop a psychology that didn't just analyze the mind, it honored the mystery of it. It's no coincidence that after his intense period of dissent and writing the Red Book, Jung would go on to develop ideas like individuation, archetypes, and the symbolic life. These were not abstract theories, they were earned in fire, and the reason he could carry them back into the world of science was because he had, in James, a model for doing exactly that, taking what seems irrational and showing how it works in life. It's important to understand just how isolated Jung was during this time. He had broken with Freud, who was more than a mentor. He was the foundation of an entire psychological movement. Jung's ideas were increasingly seen as mystical, unprovable, or even dangerous. To proceed down this path was to risk everything: reputation, career, even sanity. But William James, who had faced his own struggles with depression, religious doubt, and existential despair, had already carved out a space where this kind of risk was valid. James had argued that religious and mystical experiences could not be reduced to pathology, because they often led to increased vitality, creativity, and moral clarity. He didn't say they were always right, he said they were worth investigating, because they might point to deeper layers of human potential. Jung internalized this idea deeply. You can feel it in the way he talks about the Red Book, not as dogma, but as personal truth. And in the very act of recording these visions, even when he doubted himself, Jung was applying James's rule. Suspend your judgment, observe the effects, and see what grows from the madness. This is what makes the quote from the Red Book so revealing. He is speaking directly to the reader, but also to the skeptic in himself. He is saying, yes, this looks insane. Yes, this breaks every rule of modern science. But if you stay with it, if you look closely, if you wait for the fruits, you will see transformation. That phrase, wait for the fruits, is pure Jamesian pragmatism. It is the method Jung used to survive what could have easily been a total psychic collapse. And more than that, it became the philosophical skeleton of his entire psychology. In a way, Jung became what William James had only speculated about, a man who fully lived out the implications of pragmatism in the realm of the soul. Where James had pointed, Jung had walked. Where James had theorized, Jung had bled. And that is why their connection is so profound, because it reveals that philosophy, when applied with courage, can become salvation. This wasn't academic for Jung, it was life or death. And in those moments when the world no longer made sense, when the visions grew too dark and the voices too loud, he had a rule to hold on to, one that said, the meaning will come later. First, endure. First, record. First, descend. Then, once the storm passes, look at what remains. Look at what has grown. Look at the fruits. And what were those fruits? Not a return to the Jung of before, not a restoration of some former self, but the birth of something entirely new. A man no longer shackled by the need for external validation, a psychologist who no longer confined the soul to diagrams and diagnoses, a thinker who now moved between science and spirit with unsettling confidence, because he had survived both the collapse and the reassembly of his psyche. William James had said, "The greatest use of a life is to spend it on something that will outlast it." Jung's Red Book, once hidden, now revered, is precisely that, not because it conforms to scientific standards, but because it testifies to something. It shows what happens when one man dares to take his inner world seriously. And it would not have been written without the quiet courage Jung found in James's ideas. It's difficult to overstate how rare this was at the time. Psychology was still desperate to be taken seriously as a science. It wanted numbers, metrics, evidence, but James had already warned that a full account of human life must include not only the intellect, but the passions, the intuitions, and the inexplicable movements of the soul. And this was exactly what Jung was discovering. That the psyche does not speak in formulas. It speaks in symbols, dreams, and often in madness. But Jung's madness was not chaotic. It had structure, voice, drama. It unfolded like a myth, a personal mythology that paralleled the collective myths of humanity. And this is where James and Jung fully converge. in the idea that experience itself is sacred ground, not because it is infallible, but because it is where transformation happens. James never asked anyone to believe blindly. He simply asked us to honor what happens in us when we do, to take the risk of subjectivity seriously, to notice what ideas elevate us, what symbols stay with us, what dreams reorder our waking lives. And Jung did exactly that. He didn't sanitize his madness, he preserved it, honored it, walked through it, because in James's philosophy he had found permission to treat even his darkest visions as potential wisdom. It is no wonder that when Jung emerged from this period of inner exploration, he no longer needed to explain himself in the language of Freud or science. He had created his own language, a language of archetypes, shadows, animas, and gods. These were not fantasies. They were psychic realities. They had been tested in fire, and they had borne fruit. And this is the hidden genius of pragmatism, as Jung applied it. It does not demand that we resolve contradictions. It allows us to live within them. It says, yes, this might be madness, but madness is part of the human experience. What matters is not whether it makes sense now, but whether it gives birth to meaning later. This is why Jung could speak so openly about divine madness, why he could admit that even he saw his own visions as sickness, because the point was not to defend them. The point was to survive them, and see what came next. And what came next was a psychology unlike any the world had seen. A psychology rooted not just in therapy, but in transformation. Not just in diagnosis, but in destiny. Not just in healing symptoms, but in awakening the soul. Would Jung have reached these heights without William James? Perhaps, but it is far more likely that without James, Jung would have dismissed his madness as meaningless. He might have hidden the Red Book. He might have silenced the voices. He might have treated his own soul as a clinical problem instead of a divine mystery. But James had shown another way, a way that valued experience no matter how strange, a way that asked only this: what does it lead to? What does it awaken? What does it make possible? For Jung, it made everything possible. Long after the Red Book was finished and sealed away, long after William James had passed, and long after Jung had become a towering figure in depth psychology, the thread remained, quiet but unbroken. That thread was the pragmatic rule: suspend judgment, endure the storm, and look to the fruits. Again and again, Jung would return to this inner compass when navigating the tension between psychic experience and intellectual credibility. He never abandoned science. He never renounced the medical language he was trained in. But he expanded it, hollowed out a space inside it for mystery, and filled that space with images that only the soul could speak. This was not a rejection of reason, it was a maturation of it. And James had hinted at this too. He once wrote, "Our science is a drop, our ignorance a sea." Jung understood this intuitively. The soul was not a problem to be solved, but a world to be entered. And when he entered it, he did so with James's rule in hand, not to prove anything to others, but to survive. Because at its heart, pragmatism is a survival philosophy. It asks what works, not just what fits. And for Jung, what worked was the act of writing, surrendering, symbolizing, reflecting. Trusting that the psyche, like nature, had its own way of healing if only we listened. It's easy to romanticize Jung's descent now, as readers and students of his work. But the truth is, it was harrowing. There was no guarantee he would return from it. And that's precisely what makes his alignment with James so profound. He was not simply studying pragmatism as a theory. He was living it in real time, in the dark. He was testing it with every page of the Red Book. And his recovery, his rebirth, was not the proof of a method, but the fruit of one. Even today, this approach remains radical. We live in a culture that demands explanations, evidence, control. But Jung's story, powered by James's philosophy, reminds us that the most important truths are often the ones that arise after chaos, not before it, not during it, after. This is not a call to abandon reason. It is a call to expand what we mean by it, to admit that the psyche is more than the mind, that truth is more than facts. That meaning often arises from precisely those experiences we cannot explain, and that it's okay, more than okay, to not know what something means until later. In the end, the deepest gift James gave Jung was not a doctrine, but a stance, a posture toward the unknown, a way of standing in the fire of one's own psyche without running away or shutting it down. And Jung honored that gift by writing his madness instead of medicating it, by walking through his visions instead of dismissing them, and by trusting the process instead of demanding immediate clarity. And so the line is clear, even if history rarely draws it for us. From James's defense of mystical states to Jung's visionary descent. From pragmatism as method to individuation as path. From the fear of madness to the embrace of transformation. Carl Jung did not escape the abyss, he entered it, and he emerged not by denying its reality but by trusting in a deeper one, a reality measured not by proof but by consequence, not by logic but by fruit. And in doing so, he fulfilled the very dream of William James, that philosophy might not just be studied, but lived, that it might serve as a bridge between the inner world and the outer one, between the soul's chaos and the self's becoming. Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." Thanks to William James, he knew how to become, even in madness, especially in madness, and so do we.